Hello, everyone. This is Stacy. Welcome to the landing. Welcome back. Today's guest is a man who does not just study history, he lives it. Joel Hancock is a true son of Down East, a Harkers Island native whose voice, knowledge, and passion have become part of the fabric of our community. As a historian, Joel has spent decades researching, recording, and retelling the stories that shaped our coast, but even more than that, he has walked the paths of the people he speaks about. A devoted genealogist and keeper of family roots, Joel reminds us that history is not just found in books. It is etched in names, places, and the deep connections that hold us to home. So settle in. You're about to hear from someone who helps make sure the past keeps speaking right into our present. Well, welcome back to the landing. I am thrilled to have this young man back with me this evening. Before I say any more, I want him to introduce himself. Tell us your name and who's your crowd, where you're from.
I'm Joel Hancock from Harkers Island. I live on Harkers Island all my life. I'm related to just about everyone on the island, as I'll explain a little bit later, but mostly from the Hancock and Lewis, were my grandparents, but lived in a neighborhood with Guthrie's, Moores, and especially Willis's.
Yes. Well, we had you on when we first started back last August and got you just to say a little bit about explaining what the landing was about and why we titled this wonderful podcast, The Landing. Mm-hmm. And you promised me then that you would come back. So I'm cashing in.
Here I
am. Here you are. Well, I'm excited about what you're going to share with us tonight. So if you will, let's get started because I don't want to waste any of our time. Just jump right in because I think the folks are going to really find this interesting as well.
Well, we agreed we'd talk about a book that I had published late last year called The Education of an Island Boy.
Yes.
And it's about coming of age of Harkers Island in the mid-20th century. Mm-hmm. That was a special time. There were still a few of the people who had moved from the banks to the island that were still alive. It was 50 years. Well, by the time I came along, 60 years after the original Exodus. Mm-hmm. But I was totally surrounded by the first generation that came after them. Wow. That had been enmeshed in the stories that their parents and even their grandparents had told them earlier in their lives. And so for many of them, what happened on the banks was a memory. Mm-hmm. For us, it was stories told by people who were their memories. But they were wonderful secondhand stories, and they were all very common in what they emphasized, how the events unfolded. All right, so in that particular environment, I came of age around a group of people who were as homogenous as you can imagine any group being in modern society. Mm-hmm. Harkers Island, as I'll explain later, was when I was born in the 1950s. Harkers Island, that we know, was only 50 years old.
That's crazy to think about. Yeah, wow.
But it had been isolated because there wasn't a bridge until 1939. There wasn't a phone until after I was born. Mm-hmm. Television came late in the 50s and other things. So Harkers Island was a very, as I say, homogeneous society. And everybody was literally related to everybody else, as not just memories will tell you, but DNA tests will tell you that. You know, mm-hmm. When we check our ancestry on some of those modern DNA programs that will tell you how you're related to other people, mm-hmm. you know, it will show some people on the island that I'm related to 5 and 6 different ways. So anyway, so that was the island, and I wanted to tell something about the unique character of that, largely because that character has dissipated, and that character is a memory, just like the character of the first generation was a memory by the time I came along. Mm-hmm. My children will tell you they think the best time to build an island would have been in the 80s and 90s. You know,
I would agree.
All right, but I think, my generation thought it was the 50s and 60s. My mother and father thought it was the 20s,
Right. Right.
But their parents always thought it was before they had to leave the banks. So that's an evolving, and your children will think of, well, their memories of the island will be much different from yours.
Right.
You can remember things that they can only imagine. As I've gotten older now, in my family there were 10 of us, and now only 2 of us are still around. My sister June is 20 years older than me.
Wow.
And I think about sometimes when I look at her that she is the only person that remembers me when I was a toddler. I grew up around people that almost everyone did. But now she's the only person on earth that remembers me as a toddler.
Wow.
And we share some other memories that she's the only one that with your mother and my cousins and double cousins like your mother, there are certain memories as they pass that the group that shares those memories of each other as teenagers, that's just a small group of us left.
Wow.
And so I wanted to preserve some of those memories so that they wouldn't be lost when the last of us is no longer here. So in my book, I begin by telling about how Harkers Island came to be, which was an offshoot of Diamond City and Shackford Banks. And so would you like for me to mention, some of that?
I would love for you to, because I was born in the 70s.
Right.
And so I never questioned when did Harkers Island begin. It had always been, as far as I was concerned.
As far as you're concerned, always there.
Yeah, so please.
Well, for me, it had been too, but I learned a lot as growing up because I was a sponge for information and asking questions of old people. And then
I wish I was.
I studied in history and things. Well, you can relate to this. Harkers Island and all of the Outer Banks of North Carolina, down to Cape Lookout and Shackford Banks, was settled by people migrating from the Tidewater area of Virginia. That's where Jamestown and Williamsburg and those settlements had begun. But that was in the early 1600s. But by 1619, African slaves began to replace the indentured servants who had been brought over to work the tobacco fields and the unsuccessful gold mining that they had begun and stuff with. And so those indentured servants that had been promised land, if they worked for 7 years, many of them didn't live that long, and others, they weren't allowed to work that long because they were replaced by slaves and stuff. So they began to migrate, some to the north, some to the west, some to the southwest, North Carolina. But it was a small group of them that migrated not just south, but southeast, and that would have been down the Outer Banks of North Carolina, starting in the mid-1600s. And they would, first obviously up at Kitty Hawk and Corolla and those areas, then down to Hatteras, but each generation moving a little bit farther down. And finally, a group of them reached Cape Lookout by the end of the 1700s, by the beginning of the 19th century.
The lucky ones.
They were lucky because they stopped there. Well, not just because the land ran out there. That's where basically the southernmost point of the Outer Banks is at Cape Lookout, and then Diamonds or Shackford Banks would move it to the west.
Yeah.
But they also landed on something that had not been possible anywhere else, and that was they found a way to make a living by doing something other than fishing and shellfishing. They found a way to make hard money in the whaling industry. It wasn't really something that they came up with. Rather, there was a group of 5 families that moved from New England down here to expand the whaling industry of New England. But here it would be much different than the whaling that we think about in the stories of Moby Dick and the New England whalers and stuff, where whale ships would leave and be gone for a year and a half. Here there was a group of shore-based whaling. You could see the whales from shore because here was one of the few places on the East Coast where whales came close enough to shore they could be seen from the shore.
Wow.
So from the tall hills of Diamond City, from late February to mid-May, whales would be moving north along and would come into Lookout Bight. And they could be seen, and men would go out and harvest them in their dories and skiffs and stuff.
Wow.
And that was those 5 families that you'll know these names were Chadwick, Piggott, Leffers. Let's think of one more, Whitehurst,
Mm-hmm.
You know all those people today. Then there
Yeah.
was one other family who the guy just didn't have any Y chromosomes to pass on for more than one generation. His name was Ebenezer Harker. He came down in at about the same time as the settlers arrived here
Mm-hmm.
to Beaufort. His family was, as I said, from New England, but he was a second son in a society that was primogeniture, where the oldest son got everything.
Mm-hmm.
So he had to make a living elsewhere, and he came with those other four families to Beaufort, and he soon bought this island that was called Craney Island from a guy named Thomas Pollock, as in Pollock Street in Beaufort.
Mm-hmm.
And he moved here and married a local girl, and he named it Harkers Island. And you'll notice there's not an apostrophe. It's not a possession. It's plurality. It was going to be, this island was going to be for his family for as long as he can. And it was, for the next, basically the next 100 years, or it was all just Harker's descendants. And as I said, he had sons, but his sons had no sons. Mm-hmm. And so by the third generation, they were all Davises or Chadwicks and other names and stuff. Mm-hmm. But until 1900, Harker's Island was basically just the descendants of Ebenezer Harker and the people they had married. Mm-hmm. So in the census of 1890, there's only about 80 people on the island. Mm-hmm. And there's one rough road cut right down the middle. It was called the Middle Road, and some people call it the Old, and they still call it the Old Road today.
Old Road, yep.
But the people that had moved down the banks and become the whalers, and of course they could sustain themselves with subsistence the rest of the year with fishing and other things that they might do, hunting. Mm-hmm. They struck it pretty much rich compared to everyone else until the late 19th century. Two things happened that made it untenable to stay. One, the discovery of large stores of oil in western Pennsylvania, mm-hmm. sort of pushed the whale oil, made it unprofitable anymore. And the other was wind. There were some hurricanes that came in the 1890s, and
shifted things.
Yeah, well, I mean, hurricanes seem to come in bunches. There'd been a bunch since the 1990s through the 19-teens,
mm-hmm.
Maybe through
mm-hmm.
the 20-teens.
Mm-hmm.
When Orville Wright came to Kitty Hawk around 1901, he wrote back to his brother Wilbur describing what the banks were like. And he talked about the beautiful dunes and the sunsets and the pristine water and the sparkle and stuff. But then he concluded with a famous thing. He said, and then there's the wind. Always the wind. And as you know, especially here in the spring, this has been a windy spring. But then
mm-hmm.
in the summer, from May until through September, there's going to be a southwester that blows up every day.
Mm-hmm.
That will reach 20 miles an hour by supper time and stuff.
Yeah.
But in the 1890s, there were two hurricanes, one in 1896 and one in 1899. That actually made living on the banks impossible anymore. So they had to find another place to live. That 1890 census that found only 80 people on Harkers Island, there were almost 800 on the banks. By the 1900 census, there were only less than a dozen, and they would all be gone within a couple of years. Wow. Because the 1899 storm overran the island from the ocean and then from the sound. Mm-hmm. So that what had been arable land became beach sand. Mm-hmm. What had been fresh water became brackish water. Mm-hmm. And then it was just no way to live. Some of them moved just north of Marshallburg, from Cape, especially those around mm-hmm. Cape Lookout. Mm-hmm. Some of them moved up Bogue Sound to Broad Creek, a small group. Another group was induced by the governor of North Carolina, John Motley Moorhead, to come to Moorhead and help him to what would become Moorhead City and build a port that was going to compete with Wilmington. And he gave them several hundred acres of land to live on in what would be called the Promised Land.
Promised Land.
Now, it's promised with that ends in an E, not in a D.
Mm-hmm.
If you talk to a Promised Landers and you use a D, they'll tell you that's wrong.
Uh-huh.
Because
you got to get our names right.
Yeah, that was a pejorative term that the locals used. There they come like the children of Israel coming to the Promised Land, And so they
I wonder where that name came from.
And Shepherd Street in Moorhead City and all
mm-hmm.
that was called the Promised Land.
Mm-hmm.
Just across the sign, there were 29 families moved from the banks and squatted on land that was owned by a guy named Royal. and that would eventually be owned by the heirs of Theodore Roosevelt. But they squatted on it. Royal allowed them to live there, but he didn't give them deeds. And after about 70 years of not paying taxes, either one of them, the government forced them to reach a settlement, and the heirs of those 29 families, which by then were like 120 families, received that land. But the biggest part of them, 80% of them, just moved across back sound, about 2 miles, Harkers Island. Living on the south side of the island, you could not only see across where you came from, you could work the same signs and everything.
Yeah.
You could even go back to the places that you had left. My father, until he was in his 70s and 80s, could take you back into Banks Bay and show you where his daddy's house had been, behind the horse pen and stuff. They could still remember those places and stuff. And so one of the dynamics about when they moved, organically, those early families, and I'll tell you some of those family names in a moment, they had intermarried and they moved out and scattered along the banks from Cape Lookout all the way to Mullet Pond at the end of Shackleford Banks. When they came to the island, they got back together in family groups. And so that the island that I knew growing up was divided into, and in fact, I mentioned it in my book. I want to read you what the groups were. It said, moving east to west, it began with the Yeomanses at the eastern and extended all the way to the Brookses at the western. With the Yeomans, Roses, Gaskells, Lewises, Joneses, Wades, Nelsons, Brooks, Chadwicks, Fulchers, Davises, Fulfords, Johnsons, Scotts, Gillikins, Lawrences, Hamiltons, Dixons, Steins, Russells, Moores, and Hancocks, all in between. But then there was a big group of Guthries in many of the places, and the Willises were everywhere. There were Willis communities, but there was no family groups that didn't have Willises and stuff on. In fact, some of the original Harkers Island people, they sold the land for $1 an acre. But,
wow.
For example, my cousin, your mother's first cousin, Charles Davis, whose father was one of the heirs of the Harkers that had been on the island, had never been to the Banks. He doesn't think that Harkers Island was settled. He thinks that it was invaded. He says they were invaded by the Shackleford Willises. And so anyway, those family groups were noticeable. And your grandmother, and your mother grew up in that group of about 30 houses that all belonged to the Hancock, Willis, Moore, and Guthries. Everybody in those 30 houses belonged to one or more of those families. And so that was repeated all along the island, from the Yeomans, as I said, at Shell Point to the Brookses at Harkers Point.
Wow.
So those families settled here, and they basically brought with them the traditions, the ways of making a living and stuff that they had there, but it expanded and grew quickly once they got here to the island. Now the island, as I said, was isolated. A mail boat came, which would carry passengers if you needed a ride and stuff, but it would come several times a week. But as I said, the bridge didn't come till later, and the telephone and other things, television, not until the late 50s, early 60s and stuff. So on the island, as I said, most people lived the same way. We would later realize we were poor, but we didn't know it because everybody lived the same way. Yeah. Everybody on the island was both a fisherman and a boat builder. I'm talking about the men on the island. They had the boat builder was a necessity because of working the water and stuff. But there were several commercial boat builders on the island that build larger boats, fishing boats, commercial boats, what we called party boats, head boats, and other things like that. There were almost a dozen by the time of the 60s and stuff that young boys could get a job painting or sanding or things in a fish house and things. And then there were a few, like your ancestors, who made their living not by fishing, but by buying fish and selling them.
Yeah.
They were largely the descendants of the Harkers. Your great-grandfather on the Davis side was, a direct descendant of the Harkers, and he had a half-brother that lived close by named Charlie Davis. They ran stores as well. Now, the stores were another unique thing, because transportation was basically by walking, unless you were in a boat in the water, but stores had to be in every little part of the island.
Mm-hmm.
Like, sadly now, there's really only a couple stores on the island. But in my youth, there were a dozen.
Yeah.
Every extended community had a store.
I've realized that doing these interviews. I had no idea. Like every mile almost. Less than a mile. Half a mile.
Well, where your daddy grew up, there at the Penn Ferry Dock Road, there was a store on each corner. That was basically the downtown
Is
of
that the
island.
hub?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the post office was beside that,
Yeah.
and there was a store and a fish house at one end,
Mm-hmm.
a boat house and a crab house at the other end,
Mm-hmm.
going north and south, and then the main road there.
Yeah.
In my little part there in the mid part of the island where the Hancocks lived,
Mm-hmm.
there were 3 stores within 150 yards.
Wow.
And they were called by the proprietor's name. You had, starting from the western, you had Dallas's store.
Mm-hmm.
Then a little bit farther, directly from our house, was Norman's store.
Okay. Yeah.
That would have been your grandfather's brother.
Yeah.
And then there was Edith's store.
Mm-hmm.
And they all sold the same thing. You know, dry goods, soft drinks, candy, canned goods,
Wow.
pencils and paper. But basically that was it. That was what people basically lived off of,
Mm-hmm.
because the main groceries you got out of the water.
Mm-hmm.
And a few people grew pigs and stuff, but they were basically communal. When Aaron Moore would harvest his pigs in the fall, everybody ate off those pigs, even though Aaron had raised them and all. I mean, Aaron would bring a ham to Mama,
Mm-hmm.
or what he would call a haslet, or which was part of the liver and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But every part of the pig was used.
Wow.
Other things were communal. Christmas trees.
Mm-hmm.
Men would go to Wade Shore to cut cedar trees, and they wouldn't cut one for just their family. They would cut a boatload and put them on the shore so that people could have a cedar tree, in their house.
Wow.
But, so the land they brought it to is based, as we said in our earlier conversation, was communal.
Yeah.
The land belonged to everybody, not just to who fronted it. It belonged to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And many things were that way. The sand hole belonged to everybody, and Academy Field belonged to everybody.
Wow.
It was, and one of the reasons for that was because we were all, as I said, we were all related to each other. There had been so much I'm sure they tried to keep it outside of first or second cousins.
Yeah.
But eventually, 2 second cousins is the same as 1 cousin, So anyway, you can find that in just about every family where second and third cousins are married and stuff.
Yeah.
So on that, and the way of living on the island, as I said, was basically in fishing and boat building, and you had a few distinct professions, like owning a store or a fish house, and building some other boats, and then you had what in my book I talk about Harkers Island professionals. They weren't really professional because of education, but like Charlie Nelson was a surveyor.
Mm-hmm.
He had trained himself to be a surveyor, and even today, if you were to do some research into land titles and find a survey, it looks like it was a medieval document. The writing is so ornate and stuff. And Raymond Guthrie was sort of like the attorney. He hadn't finished high school, but if you had to send something back to Sears Roebuck and had to write a letter about it, he would be the one to write. Or if you want to write to Congressman to have your son transferred back into the 5th District, who was in Alaska, and you wanted him back in North Carolina, he would write the letter for you.
Wow.
That kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had Maxwell Willis, who was like the island's engineer.
Mm-hmm.
He would later be the head of the the REA on the island.
Yeah.
But he would be the one that could tell you how things should be designed, how much weight will that crossbeam hold, and things of that sort. He was, he just schooled himself in things of basic engineering and architecture and things. So you did have professionals and stuff on the island. Some of the things that happened, that women mostly stayed at home with children, but even that was, women especially took responsibility for all the children in the neighborhood, not just theirs, wherever they went. Your mother can tell you about going to school on the island. You couldn't skip school because anybody that saw you knew you were skipping school.
Mm-hmm. You were supposed to be.
And tell your mother.
Uh-huh.
And if you acted out or you used profanity or vulgarity, I'll tell your mother. you know, and so you were
And
being
that had some weight.
and watched over all the time. And another thing that a tradition I wish was still true that was a big part of my youth in the summer is that neighborhood women would gather at the shore in their dresses or frocks and go swimming. They would, a group of a dozen or more, would walk out to where the water was up to their waist and then would get down on their knees so that the water was to their shoulders and sit there for just to cool down in their dresses.
Wow.
No towels or anything. And then as a group, they'd come back and go to their houses and stuff and wash off and stuff.
Oh,
but,
my
you know,
gosh.
men lived at the shore, the landing, as you called it. And so as boys especially, we were around men all the time. And that's where they worked and where we played. One of the, I probably running over time here for a moment, but one of the things about the island that was notable, I'll mention two things. One, playing ball. Baseball was the big thing. And you followed other things, but baseball was what you did. But to play baseball, it was a game, but to be good at it, you had to work at it. Well, fishing was work. But if you were good at it, it was like a game to you. And so what were the games of boys and the work of men were interchangeable and stuff. They would come home from working in the water to play baseball. And they would, before going to work on the nets and the net spreads and stuff like that, they would play baseball and then go to work. So those things were interchangeable. So everything was a part of everything else. Now, some people felt claustrophobic. People who came here, they felt like everybody knew too much of their business. I've often heard that. Well, no one on the island noticed that because that's how it had always been. Everybody knew everybody's business.
Right. And
so there was a mutual responsibility for everything. We did have a theater on the island. You probably remember that as an arcade later on. It was built in the 1930s. It was called the Charity Theater. And it was named the Charity Theater because it was built not as a theater, but as a gathering, a hall for a fraternal organization called the Charitable Brotherhood. The men on the island got together and all contributed to building that building where they could go to meet. To sort of just like a hangout for men and stuff. But the reason why it's called a Charitable Brotherhood, whenever one of the members died, every other member would contribute a certain amount of money to the widow.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, none of them had life insurance, but that would be if you had 40 or 50 men and each one gave $50, that was a sizable sum. And so that was where but eventually that sort of died out and it was purchased by Earl Davis and turned into a theater that lasted until well into the late 70s and early 80s and then became an arcade and stuff.
I remember going to one movie anyway. But the arcade was the thing.
Shows were on Thursday and Friday night, the same show, and then a different show on Saturday night. And it was 20 cents on Thursday and Friday and 25 cents on Saturday night.
Wow.
Saturday night was usually a movie that was only 4 or 5 years old. Thursday or Friday was a movie, that may be 10 or 20 years old.
Right.
So that was entertainment. And another thing that was big on entertainment was boat racing. In the summer, on Saturday mornings, you would gather at the landing and boats would, you could hear the boats howling up and down the shore. I remember my brother Telford and I my brother Mike carried us in a boat where he was going to be racing with one of his friends. And he would want us to get on the stern of the boat, holding on a rope to lean back so that the weight would be in the back. So to push it faster. One of my friends was with his brother I won't mention it by name, but he was racing my brother Mike, and neither one could get ahead, so his brother made him jump overboard to reduce the weight in the boat, thinking that would help. So anyway, that was how life really began on the island. Was leaving the banks and coming here. Now, that's the first section of my book. The next section will be about. I tell it in the context of my extended family, my grandparents and parents, to give it a structure and meaning to how life progressed and stuff for them. After that, I tell about what school was like on the island, what working and playing was like on the island. And then I had 3 sections of that, and as I said, we'll talk about these later, about the special people on the island. There's about 40 or different stories that of the people that were special in a lot. Some of them were sublime and some of them were ridiculous, but nonetheless, on the island, there was a story for every principle of life.
Yeah.
That it could be emphasized. And by the time you were a teenager, you didn't even have to hear the story. They would just refer you to it, and you were expected to know what was meant.
Yeah.
If someone was, you loved somebody, you loved them more than Mark loved Tom Tom. Well, everybody knew how much Mark loved Tom Tom, so it
had meaning.
Yeah. So and hyperbole, as I mentioned in my book, I didn't know what a hyperbole was until I was probably in college.
But you used it all the time.
But that was all the time. It was, it would go to the extreme to make a point. For example, Weldon Edwards used to say the wind was blowing so hard that he had to shine his light at a 45-degree angle to see the dot. But anyway, so those stories taught principles and stuff. And I want to close on one other thing unique to the island.
You're good.
I've talked about how neighborhoods and families and those family names and stuff, but given names were also special. Everybody was named after someone else. And I have had more comments on this paragraph from my book than any other.
No, please share.
I say that most of us were called by both our first and middle names because most everyone was named after someone else. At other times, people were labeled by their nearest kinship. You wouldn't just say something happened or belonged to Mary. You felt a need to be more specific. Was it Mary Ann, Mary Frances, Mary Catherine, or even Norman's Mary, Weldon's Mary, Tommy Lewis's Mary, or Eddie's Mary? There was also Luther's Mary, who when she was married became William's Mary, who had a son called Mary's Michael. He lived almost next door to Elsie Mae's Johnny William, who was not to be confused with Johnny Lane, Johnny Wayne, Johnny Michael, Johnny Manley, the son of Johnny Boo, or Johnny Van, the son of Alenus's Johnny. If Mama sent me to get something from Ollie, she had to be more specific. Was it Big Ollie or Little Ollie? In 100 ways and every day, I was reminded of who I was and what and where our crowd had been. Knowing those things made me feel as if I was part of something special and something that mattered. So, even names on the island had a significance. Shakespeare famously says, "What's in a name? You know, remember what rose by any other name would spell as sweet." Right. But it turns out a lot's in a name.
Yeah.
That especially who it reminds you of. In fact, I've often heard that the most beautiful sound in the world is the sound of your name said by someone who loves you. And so another woman that I quote a lot is Marjorie Hinckley, who says that there's no one you wouldn't love if you knew their story. Well, the name is the beginning of the story. Yeah. Everybody in your family can tell you where that name came from, whether it be Lana or Perry Lynn or Woody, and in my family is all the same. And there is a meaning attached to that you're supposed to live up to.
Yeah, that's so true.
Well, anyway, I've probably run you over a little bit.
No. This has been just right, and it's flown by. I've enjoyed it. Thank you for coming, and you do promise to come back because we want to hear about the rest of the story.
Okay, I'll be glad to.
All right. Well, I love you, and I'll be talking with you soon.
Thank you. And the feeling is mutual.
Mutual. Thank you again for joining us to The Landing. This podcast is brought to you by the Core Sound Waterfowl Museum and Heritage Center. I am your host, Stacy Davis Baisden, and today's podcast was produced by April Davidson. Tune in next week as we continue learning, sharing, and remembering together. If you'd like to hear more, check out our previous episodes where you get your podcasts. Until then, stay safe and be kind.